He was the kind of man you'd never look at twice, a quiet figure in Wichita, Kansas. He mowed his lawn, went to church on Sundays, led Cub Scout meetings, and waved politely at neighbors. People knew him as Dennis Rader, church president, husband, father of two. Ordinary, unremarkable, almost boring. But behind that calm suburban mask lives something no one could imagine. Dennis Rader was BTK, a sadistic serial killer who spent 3 decades binding, torturing, and killing innocent victims, while taunting police and the public with chilling letters that demanded one thing: recognition. What makes this story so terrifying isn't just the brutality of his crimes, it's the mask he wore. Think about it. A man who lectured his children about morality, who enforced Douglas laws as a compliance officer, was secretly fantasizing about murder. A man who read scripture in church was keeping detailed journals of his fantasies that turned into blood-soaked reality. And all the while, no one suspected a thing. His wife, his kids, his congregation, his co-workers. They were living next to BTK and didn't even know. Italiano. Now imagine being in Wichita in the 1970s. Families were being slaughtered in their own homes. Women vanished without a trace. The killer left behind almost no evidence, only cryptic letters. He gave himself his own name: BTK. Bind, torture, kill. That was his signature. His victims weren't just murdered. They were controlled, degraded, and left in states so horrifying that investigators knew they were dealing with a sadist unlike any other. And then came the arrogance. Rader didn't just kill, he needed everyone to know it. He wrote 2 newspapers and television stations, demanding attention. In his letters, he described the murders in disturbing detail, mocking investigators and daring them to catch him. He wasn't satisfied with taking lives. He wanted control over the city itself. Wichita lived in fear, knowing BTK was out there, watching, waiting, and laughing at the people trying to stop him. The most chilling part: while the city panicked, Rader went home to dinner with his family. He tucked his children into bed. He smiled at neighbors. He was both the predator and the man next door. That duality, that mask of normalcy, is what makes Dennis Rader one of the most terrifying killers in history. This is not just the story of a murderer. It's the story of a man who lived 2 lives so convincingly that for decades, no one knew they were clapping for him in church on Sunday, then locking their doors at night in terror of BTK. And as we unravel his story, part by part, you'll see how a boy with disturbing fantasies became a man who needed the world to know his name, and how that need for recognition would become his downfall. So let's begin at the surface, with the mask he wore so perfectly. The life of Dennis Rader, the church president, the father, the ordinary man who was anything but. Subscribe now, because the deeper we go into BTK's story, the more you will see how horrifyingly easy it is for a killer to hide in plain sight. And in the next part, we stepped into his double life, the mask of normalcy that kept him invisible for 30 years. On the outside, Dennis Rader's life looked like a picture of American normalcy. He lived in a modest house in Park City, Kansas. He was married to his wife Paula for over 3 decades and had 2 children, a son and a daughter. He went to church every Sunday, wary head didn't tea, just sit in the pewsy, stood at the front. Serving as president of the congregation, parents trusted him with their kids in Cub Scouts. Neighbors waved to him as he drove off in his sedan, clipboard in hand, working as a compliance officer for the town. If anyone looked at Dennis Rader, they saw nothing more than a quiet, responsible family man. But behind that smile, every role he played was part of a mask. Rader was a master of disguise, not with costumes or fake identities, but with a life he constructed around himself. Being a church leader gave him respectability. Leading scouts gave him access to trust. Working as a compliance officer gave him power. He wasn't just blending in. He was building a shield of credibility so strong that even if suspicions arose, people would dismiss them. Dennis. No, not him. He's the most ordinary man in town. That's how dangerous his mask was. Think about the irony. His job as a compliance officer meant he enforced the smallest rules. He wrote tickets for neighbors who let their grass grow too high. He scolded residents for letting their dogs run loose. He wielded authority with petty cruelty in the daylight, while at night he was breaking every law of humanity, hunting, binding, torturing, and killing. He enjoyed the hypocrisy. It was part of the control. At home, he played the role of dutiful father and husband. His children had no idea their bedtime stories were told by a man who had spent his day stalking women in alleys or fantasizing about the next project. His wife believed she was married to a strict but decent man, never realizing his study was filled with writings and sketches of bondage fantasies. The mask worked so perfectly because it was believable. He wasn't glamorous like Ted Bundy or eccentric like John Wayne Gacy. He was painfully, boringly average, and that's exactly why no one suspected him. In public, Rader perfected his performance. He smiled at church potlucks, shook hands firmly, and lectured about morality. He gave sermons on responsibility, on family, on faith. But deep down, every smile was a cover, every handshake a lie. He was hiding in plain sight, and he loved it. To Rader, the mask wasn't just protection, it was part of the thrill. The thought that he could be praised on Sunday morning and stalk a victim by Sunday night fed his ego in ways killing alone could never satisfy. For 30 years, that mask kept him safe. While Wichita police searched for BTK, they never looked at Dennis Rader, the man bringing donuts to church. They never questioned the family man leading scouts. His mask wasn't just normalcy, it was camouflage. He built a life so unremarkable, so perfectly dull, that even his own family had no idea they were living under the roof of a serial killer. And that's what makes Dennis Rader more terrifying than most, because his mask wasn't a clown costume or a TV persona. It was the everyday life of an ordinary man. And if BTK could live unnoticed for decades in a quiet Kansas suburb, who else might be hiding behind the same kind of mask right now? To understand how Dennis Rader became BTK, we need to go back before the mask of normalcy, before the church sermons and scout meetings, because the seeds of a killer were planted in his childhood. Dennis Len Rader was born in 1945 in Pittsburgh, Kansas, the oldest of 4 sons. On paper, he grew up in an ordinary working-class family. His father worked long hours as a mechanic to provide for the family. His mother often juggled multiple responsibilities at home. But young Dennis didn't see it that way. He felt neglected. His parents weren't abusive, but they were emotionally distant, rarely showing affection. For a child craving attention, that coldness planted the first feelings of resentment. By the time Dennis was in grade school, his imagination was already turning dark. He wasn't playing cowboys and soldiers like other kids. Instead, he developed a disturbing fascination with control. He admitted later that he started tying up cats and dogs, practicing knots, watching how helpless they looked when bound. That sense of domination lit a spark that would never burn out. Even more chilling, he began fantasizing. He would draw pictures of women bound and gagged. At night, he imagined himself as the one holding the ropes, the one with absolute control. For Dennis, this wasn't just curiosity. It was the beginning of an obsession. He would later confess that he called these fantasies the factor, a private world where he could imagine, rehearse, and relive scenarios of bondage and control over and over again. In school, he was quiet. Teachers described him as average. He wasn't the class clown, wasn't the troublemaker, and wasn't outstanding at anything. Invisible. And yet, while other boys were crushing on classmates, Dennis was daydreaming about tying them up. His drawings, hidden from others, reflected desires too dark for a child his age. There were other warning signs, too. He stole women's underwear, an early act of fetishism tied to his fantasies. He spied on neighbors, sneaking glances into windows. This wasn't innocent. Curiosity was predatory behavior, escalating step by step. As he entered adolescence, Dennis learned to hide his urges. He discovered that in public, people respected the boy who followed rules, who stayed quiet, who didn't cause problems. So he leaned into that role, the ordinary, obedient boy. But in private, his mind grew more twisted. His fantasies became more detailed, more violent. By the time he reached adulthood, the two halves of Dennis Rader's life were set. The public side, the polite, invisible neighbor. The private side, a boy who had been fantasizing about domination and control for years, who had already rehearsed in his mind what he would one day make real. This is the part most people don't want to believe, that the monster we come to know as BTK was already forming in a quiet Kansas neighborhood, in the body of a boy who looked completely normal on the outside. And yet, those early years were in just the roots of his fantasies. They were the blueprint for the double life he would master as an adult. It was a cold morning in Wichita, Kansas, January 15th, 1974. For most families, it was an ordinary day, but for one household, the Oteros, it would be their last. Inside their modest suburban home lived Joseph and Julie Otero, along with their children. Joseph was a former Air Force man, disciplined and protective. Julie was a devoted mother. Their children were lively, close-knit, and just starting their school routines that morning. No one could have guessed that lurking outside was a man who had been rehearsing this moment for years, Dennis Rader. To the Oteros, he was a stranger, but to Rader, they were what he called a project. That was his chilling word for his victims. As if they were assignments on a checklist, he had stalked them, studied their routines, planned exactly when to strike. And that morning, he decided to put his fantasies into action. Dennis broke into the house armed with a gun and his hit kit, ropes, bindings, and tools he prepared in advance. Once inside, he confronted Joseph and Julie. He pretended it was just a robbery, telling them if they cooperated, no one would get hurt. But his intentions were far darker. What unfolded was a slow, calculated nightmare. Rader forced the family members to be tied up. He later admitted he enjoyed the sense of power, the complete control over life and death. He bound Joseph first, strangling him until the father collapsed. Then Julie, forced to watch her husband die before suffering the same fate. But it didn't end there. The two youngest Otero children, Joseph Jr. and Josephine, just 9 and 11 years old, were. Dennis took his time, methodically binding them, ignoring their pleas. He strangled Joseph Jr., then turned to Josephine, who begged for her life. Instead, Rader hung her from a basement pipe, watching as she slowly suffocated. The brutality of the Otero murders shocked Wichita. For members of a family wiped out in one morning in their own home. To the community, it seemed senseless, random, an unspeakable tragedy. But to Dennis Rader, it was the ultimate fulfillment of his childhood fantasies. Even more disturbing, he wasn't content with the murders themselves. He wanted people to know. Within weeks, he began sending anonymous letters to local newspapers and police, describing what he had done. He demanded recognition. He wanted the world to understand there was a killer in their midst. And not just any killer. He wanted a name. He told them to call him BTK, standing for his personal formula. Bind, torture, kill. It was the beginning of a game that would last decades. A sadistic man taunting law enforcement, feeding on their frustration, enjoying the fear he created. For Wichita, the Otero murders marked the start of a nightmare. But for Dennis Rader, they were only the beginning. He had tasted power, and he wanted more. For most serial killers, the act of murder is the climax. They stalk, they plan, they kill, and then they move on. But for Dennis Rader, that wasn't enough. Murder wasn't just about power or fantasy. It was about recognition. After the Otero murders, Wichita police scrambled to make sense of what had happened. 4 lives had been destroyed, and there were no clear suspects. But while detectives searched for answers, Dennis Rader sat at home, quietly boiling with frustration. The newspapers called the murders a tragedy, a random act of violence. No one knew it was him. And to Dennis, that was unacceptable. He didn't just want to kill. He wanted credit. Weeks after the Otero murders, a letter arrived at a local newspaper. It was strange, detailed, and deeply disturbing. Inside, the writer described exactly what happened in the Otero home details. Only the killer would know. But it wasn't just a confession. It was a demand. The writer insisted that the media and police recognize him by a name. BTK: bind, torture, kill. His formula, his brand. This wasn't a man hiding in shame. This was a killer who wanted a spotlight. And 4 investigators. That made him even more dangerous. BTK wasn't content with silence. He craved an audience. He fed on fear not just from his victims, but from the entire community. Rader mailed other letters too, taunting the police, mocking their failure to catch him. Sometimes he would send poems, scrawled with dark humor. Other times, he would describe his fantasies in graphic detail. It was all about control. Control over his victims, control over the police, and control over his public image. The letters weren't just chilling, they revealed his arrogance. He saw himself as smarter than everyone else. He told investigators they would never catch him. He bragged about how carefully he planned his projects. He compared himself to other infamous killers, insisting he deserved a place among them. But here's the terrifying part. He wasn't wrong. Wichita became paralyzed with fear. Women checked their doors twice. Neighborhoods whispered about the unknown killer. Everyone was on edge, because BTK wanted them to be. And every time the media reported on his letters, Rader got exactly what he craved. Attention. This hunger for recognition wasn't just an afterthought, it was part of his psychology. Killing gave him power, but fame gave him immortality. He wasn't satisfied being a faceless monster. He wanted to be remembered, studied, feared. And so, every time the city started to move on, BTK found a way to pull himself back into the headlines. He thrived on the terror he created. He wanted to prove he was untouchable, that the police couldn't stop him, that his name BTK would live forever. For Wichita, the horror wasn't just that a sadistic killer was on the loose. The horror was that he wanted them to know he was still out there, watching, waiting, ready to strike again. And soon, he would. On the surface, Dennis Rader looked like the picture of an ordinary, respectable man. To his neighbors in Wichita, Kansas, he was the guy next door come. Polite, almost boring. He was the kind of man who waved while mowing his lawn, attended church every Sunday, and stopped to chat about the weather. But behind that quiet smile was the monster who signed his letters with 3 chilling letters. By the late 1970s and into the 1980s, Rader was building what looked like a model suburban life. He had married, started a family, and become the president of his local church congregation. He volunteered with the Boy Scouts, leading young boys on camping trips. He even worked as a compliance officer for the city of Park City, enforcing small ordinances like leash laws and lawn regulations. Imagine the irony. A man who was binding, torturing, and killing in the shadows by night yet, lecturing his neighbors about keeping their dogs tied up during the day. To those around him, he seemed disciplined, responsible, even moral, and that's exactly why no one suspected him. But the truth was that Dennis never left BTK behind. His family life and community image were just camouflaged. Behind closed doors, his fantasies only grew darker. He filled journals with disturbing writings, creating detailed drawings of bound women. He called his victims projects, reducing human lives to tasks he wanted to complete. When he couldn't kill, he rehearsed. He would stalk potential victims for weeks, learning their schedules, writing about them in coded notes. He practiced breaking into houses, preparing hit kits with ropes, tape, and weapons. Killing was not random, it was a ritual, and if the opportunity didn't arise, he fed on his fantasies until the hunger became unbearable. At home, he maintained the image of a caring father. His own children had no idea what their dad was hiding. In fact, years later, his daughter would recall moments where she sat on his lap, or he read bedtime stories while at the same time, that very night, he might slip away into the darkness to hunt another victim. This double life wasn't just about survival. It was about thrill. Rader loved knowing he was fooling everyone around him. To him, it proved his superiority, his ability to walk in 2 worlds at once. Respected citizen and sadistic killer, and his job as a security system installer in the 1970s only added another layer of horror. Imagineth, families terrified of BTK hired a young technician to install alarms and locks, thinking it would keep them safe. But sometimes, that technician was Dennis Rader himself, a very predator they were trying to keep out. BT's point, BTK had cemented himself as a master of deception. He didn't just hide in the shadows. He lived in plain sight. He could sit in a pew on Sunday morning, shake hands with neighbors, and smile as though nothing was wrong, just days after ending someone's life. The chilling part wasn't just that Dennis Rader killed. It was that for decades, he blended so seamlessly into normal life that no one, not his wife, not his children, not his community, ever suspected a thing. And yet, even with his double life perfected, the hunger to kill never truly went away. To understand Dennis Rader, you can't just look at the crimes. You have to step inside his mind, and that is where the true horror lives. Rader wasn't a man who killed in fits of rage or in moments of desperation. He was methodical, calculating, and disturbingly patient. He planned his murders with precision, studying his victims like they were puzzles to be solved. He called them projects or hits, stripping away their humanity. To him, these were not people. They were assignments, tasks he needed to complete to satisfy his dark urges. And those urges had roots stretching all the way back to his childhood. Rader admitted to violent fantasies from a young age. He was fascinated with binding and trapping animals. He would draw crude sketches of women tied up, imagining himself in total control. The fantasy of domination became his secret world, and as he grew older, it only expanded. But what made Rader so chilling was not just the fantasies, it was the way he merged them with real life. He lived two identities. Dennis, the church man, the family man, the Boy Scout leader, and BTK, the predator, the planner, the savior. He loved the duality. The secret made him feel powerful. In his own words, the murders were about the thrill of bondage, the thrill of control. Psychologists who later studied Rader described him as a textbook narcissist. He lacked empathy, felt entitled, and believed he was smarter than everyone else. Killing wasn't just about pleasure, it was about proving superiority. He enjoyed outsmarting police, feeding them clues, taunting them with letters. Every time BTK's name appeared in the headlines, it validated his sense of importance. But it wasn't only about ego. There was sadism at the core of who Dennis Rader was. He didn't simply kill his victims. He bound them, tortured them, prolonged their suffering. He wanted to hear them beg. He wanted to feel their terror. To him, their pain was part of the ritual. And disturbingly, he kept trophies. Rader would take items from his victims' jewelry, clothing, personal belongings. In his private time, he relived the murders by revisiting these tokens, combining them with his drawings and writings. It was a cycle. Plan, hunt, kill, remember, fantasize, repeat. He even created his own twisted terminology. His victims weren't people. They were projects. His killings weren't crimes. They were hits. His fantasies weren't just daydreams. They were rehearsals. He treated murder like an art form, and he was the self-proclaimed artist. What made him even more terrifying was how ordinary he looked from the outside. Rader thrived on the contradiction. To him, blending into society wasn't just cover, it was part of the thrill. He loved the idea that no one suspected the man leading prayers in church or scolding kids about lawn care was also BTK. In the end, Dennis Rader was not simply a killer. He was a predator, fueled by fantasy, obsessed with control, and intoxicated by the illusion of superiority. He killed because it made him feel alive, important, powerful. And for decades, he was able to balance both sides of his life, the respectable citizen and the sadistic predator. But as with all predators, the hunger never stayed quiet for long. By the early 1990s, the BTK case had gone cold. After years of terrorizing Wichita, sending taunting letters, and taking lives, Dennis Rader suddenly went silent. No murders linked to his name. No messages to the media. No clues for detectives. It was as if the killer had vanished. For law enforcement, the silence was puzzling. Serial killers rarely just stop. Some thought BTK might have died. Others believed he was in prison for an unrelated crime. A few even wondered if he had moved to another city, carrying his reign of terror elsewhere. Whatever the truth, Wichita began to breathe again. The fear started to fade. People whispered about BTK in past tense, as though he was just a nightmare the city had finally woken up from. But Dennis Rader hadn't disappeared. He had simply gone underground. Behind his suburban mask, he was still alive. Still fantasizing. Still feeding the hunger. By then, he was deep into his life as a father, a husband, and a church leader. Outwardly, he was respectable. Inwardly, he was reliving his past crimes, flipping through his drawings, revisiting the trophies he had taken from his victims. He later admitted that the fantasies never stopped, dead dem daydreams, but without new murders to fulfill them. He replayed old scenes in his mind. He enjoyed the control he had once felt. It was his private world, invisible to everyone else. For over a decade, the city remained quiet. Police had nearly given up hope of ever catching BTK. But then, in 2004, a shocking twist brought the nightmare back. After 25 years of hiding, Dennis Rader couldn't resist any longer. His ego, his need for recognition, pulled him back into the spotlight. Out of nowhere, BTK sent a letter to a Wichita newspaper. Inside were details about one of his old murders, proof that the killer was still alive. The letter reignited fear across the community. A new generation of Wichita residents, many who had only heard the stories as children, now faced the chilling truth. BTK was not a legend. He was real. He was alive, and he was still out there. Over the following months, Rader continued sending communications letters, packages, puzzles. He left disturbing messages in cereal boxes, wrote poems about his crimes, and once again, taunted police. Just like in the 1970s, he demanded attention. He wanted to remind everyone that BTK had never left. What no one knew was that this return would be his undoing. For decades, Rader had gotten away with murder because of his meticulous planning. But now, his arrogance was clouding his judgment. His desire for fame outweighed his carefulness. Every letter he sent, every communication he dropped, was a breadcrumb leading investigators closer. And so, the silence ended. BTK was back, but this time his craving for recognition would open the door for police to finally unmask him. For 3 decades, Dennis Rader had outsmarted the police. He believed he was untouchable, too careful to ever be caught. But in 2005, his arrogance, the same pride that made him write letters and demand the name BTK, became his downfall. It started with a simple question. In one of his taunting letters to the media, Rader asked if police could trace a floppy disk. He wanted to use it for his next message, but didn't want to risk exposure. The authorities responded through a newspaper ad, assuring him it was safe. Believing he was still smarter than everyone else, Rader sent in a purple floppy disk. That disk was his fatal mistake. Investigators quickly examined it and found metadata digital fingerprints that Rader didn't understand. The file had last been saved at a church computer, and the registered user was listed as Dennis. The church, Christ Lutheran in Wichita, where Rader just happened to be president of the congregation. The walls closed in. Police began quiet surveillance, collecting DNA samples from his family to confirm their suspicions. The evidence matched. After decades of hunting, they finally had their man. On February 25, 2005, Dennis Rader was arrested. The moment stunned Wichita. Neighbors were shocked. How could the mild-mannered compliance officer, the father, the church leader, BBT? The truth was unthinkable, but the evidence was undeniable. In custody, Rader revealed his true self. Gone was the quiet, boring, suburban man. Instead, he launched into cold, emotionless confessions. He described his murders in chilling detail, explaining how he stalked victims, tied them up, and carried out his rituals. He spoke of them as projects, with no remorse, no empathy, no humanity. In court, the horror only deepened. Rader stood before the judge and calmly recounted each killing. His voice was steady, almost casual, as if describing a work routine. He explained how he prepared his hit kits, how he watched his victims, how he took his time. The jury, the families, and the world watched in stunned silence as this seemingly ordinary man described acts of unimaginable cruelty. The trial became a media circus. Reporters from across the country gathered to cover the fall of the man who had once demanded to be remembered as BTK. But instead of the criminal mastermind he saw himself as, the world now saw the truth. A narcissistic predator who had destroyed lives to feed his fantasies. Rader was sentenced to 10 consecutive life terms, 1 for each of his confirmed victims. He would never walk free again. But even in sentencing, there was no closure. Rader never showed real remorse. He never shed tears for his victims. Instead, he seemed fascinated by his own story, as if he enjoyed reliving the attention. Even behind bars, he wanted to control the narrative. For the families of his victims, the capture ended the mystery, but not the pain. Wichita finally knew who BTK was, but the man sitting in court was even more terrifying than the shadow that had haunted them for 30 years. Dennis Rader, the man who called himself BTK, is serving 10 consecutive life sentences in El Dorado Correctional Facility. He will never step foot outside prison walls again, yet even there, he never stopped trying to control how people saw him. From the beginning, Rader's crimes were about power and attention. He didn't just want to kill, he wanted people to know who BTK was. He wanted his name in headlines, his letters published, his terror felt. In prison, that obsession never left him. He wrote letters to journalists, tried to craft his own autobiography, and even sketched drawings of his fantasies. He desperately wanted to remain relevant, even as the world moved on. But what truly lingers from BTK's case is not just the brutality of his crimes, it's the chilling reminder that monsters often look ordinary. Rader wasn't a drifter, a loner, or the creepy neighbor everyone avoided. He was the president of his church congregation. He taught his children right from wrong. He enforced city codes, lecturing people about keeping their grass trimmed or leashing their dogs. And all the while, he was secretly binding, torturing, and killing innocent people. That is, the legacy of Dennis Rader. Proof that the most terrifying killers don't lurk in shadows. They live next door. They mow their lawns. They wave hello. They sit in pews on Sundays. They look ordinary until one day the mask slips. For law enforcement, the BTK case became a textbook example of how patience, technology, and persistence can bring down even the most elusive predators. His capture showed the importance of DNA evidence and digital forensics, things Rader never understood and ultimately underestimated. But for the victims' families, the legacy is one of endless grief. No sentence, no trial, no confession could undo the decades of pain he caused. To them, Rader's obsession with being remembered isn't about history, it's about stolen lives, stolen futures, and wounds that never truly heal. And perhaps the most ironic twist of all, the very thing that kept Rader going, the need to be remembered, to be recognized, to be called BTK was what brought him down. His ego made him send that floppy disk. His arrogance made him believe he was untouchable. In the end, Dennis Rader wasn't caught because of brilliance, but because of his own weakness, vanity. Even today, his story echoes as a warning. Evil doesn't always scream. Sometimes it smiles. Sometimes it shakes your hand. Sometimes it teaches your kids, and that's what makes it truly terrifying. Dennis Rader, the BTK killer, showed the world that the most dangerous predators are often the ones hiding in plain sight. Ordinary faces, ordinary lives, extraordinary darkness. If you want more chilling stories of killers who walked among us, make sure to subscribe and join us for the next case.